The sun was a hammer, and the Badlands were its anvil. It hammered the cracked earth until it split into 1,000 parched veins, hammered the life from the scrub brush, and hammered the silence into the very bones of the man who moved through it. Atsa Goldtooth felt the heat not on his skin, but in his marrow. His moccasins made no sound on the shimmering alkali flats, a landscape of bleached skulls and the ghosts of forgotten rivers. He was tracking a stolen horse, a simple act of recovery that had led him deep into the territory of men who saw his presence as an intrusion, an old wound that refused to heal. He moved with the patient rhythm of the desert itself, his gaze sweeping the horizon, reading the story told in bent twigs and disturbed pebbles. But it wasn't his eyes that found the first sign of trouble. It was his ears. A sound thin and desperate snagged on the hot wind. It was a cry stripped of its strength, a muffled plea that seemed to rise from the baked ground itself. It was wrong. The desert had its own voices, the hiss of a sidewinder, the cry of a hawk. But this was the sound of human suffering, a sound that always meant the same thing: violence. His hand rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt as he changed direction, his every sense alert. The sound led him to a jagged scar in the earth, the collapsed entrance to the old Silver Creek mine. The place was a monument to failure, its timbers rotting like skeletal fingers reaching for a sky that offered no mercy. The air grew thick with the smell of stale dust and a chilling stillness that belied the frantic sound he had heard. The plea came again, weaker this time, from the darkness of the mine shaft. Atsa slid down the loose scree of the entrance, the darkness swallowing him whole. It was cooler inside a damp, oppressive cold that clung to his skin. He drew a match from his pouch, the flare of sulfur, a brief angry star that pushed back the gloom. The light fell upon a figure slumped against a support beam, bound hand and foot with thick rope. A heavy canvas sack was cinched tight over their head, a cruel and final touch of humiliation. He drew his knife. The blade was a sliver of captured daylight in the gloom. He moved forward, his steps measured, expecting a trap. There was none, only the rasping breaths of the prisoner. The rope gave way. The knots were clumsy, tied in haste. He reached for the sack, his fingers brushing against trembling skin. He pulled it free. Dust choked the air. A woman blinked in the sudden dim light, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. Her face was smudged with dirt, her lips cracked and dry. She was a settler, that much was clear from her calico dress, now torn and filthy. But it wasn't her face that made Atsa's blood run cold. It wasn't the fear in her eyes or the raw, chafed skin on her wrists. It was what lay against the hollow of her throat. A tarnished silver locket suspended on a delicate chain. It swung gently with her ragged breaths, the metal catching the faint light. Engraved on its surface, intricate and unmistakable, was a juniper tree, its branches reaching its roots deep. It was identical to the one he had seen only once before, 15 years ago. Identical to the one he had tried for so long to forget. The memory, a locked box in his mind, burst open. He was a boy again, running through smoke and chaos, the smell of burning pine filling his lungs. He saw the fire, a ravenous orange beast devouring a settler's homestead. He heard the screams, and he saw that locket clutched in the hand of a woman reaching for a child he could not save. The raid had been a mistake, a terrible miscalculation by young hot-headed warriors. It had ended in a tragedy that had stained his soul. The woman before him gasped, pulling him back to the present. Who are you?" She whispered, her voice a raw-edged shard of sound. Atsa looked from her face to the locket and back again. The stolen horse was forgotten. The simple act of recovery had become something else entirely. The desert had not offered him a victim to rescue. It had handed him a piece of his own shattered past, a ghost made of silver and stone. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the mind's damp air that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The town of Redemption Gulch, baked under the same unforgiving sun as the badlands that surrounded it, a festering collection of raw lumber and false fronts clinging to the edge of civilization. As Atsa rode in with the woman, Ilara seated behind him on his horse, the town watched. Eyes peered from behind dusty window panes and from the shades of warped boardwalks. He was a familiar, if unwelcome sight, a Navajo who walked the white man's world but belonged to neither. Today, however, the usual suspicion was sharpened with a new, hungry curiosity. He strode down Redemption Gulch's main street, his moccasins silent on the warped boardwalks that groaned under the weight of others' boots. He led the horse toward the sheriff's office, a squat, sun-blasted building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own sign. Ilara, still weak, leaned against him, her presence a magnet for the town's stares. He could feel their judgment a palpable force, as tangible as the grit of the dust between his teeth. They saw a Navajo warrior and a vulnerable white woman, and their minds leapt to the only conclusion they knew. Inside, Sheriff Brody was a man worn smooth by the harshness of the frontier. His face was a roadmap of busted hopes and long nights, but his eyes were sharp. He looked from Atsa to the disheveled woman, his expression unreadable. "What's this gold tooth?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Found her in the old Silver Creek mine. Tied up." Atsa said his words spare. He helped Ilara into a chair where she slumped, her body still racked with shivers despite the oppressive heat. Brody gave her a glass of water, which she drank with a desperate thirst. "Who did this to you, ma'am?" Ilara's eyes darted toward Atsa, then to the sheriff. "Men," she stammered. "3 of them. They took me from my wagon on the North Trail." Just then the door swung open with a bang that made everyone flinch. Bartholomew Thorne filled the doorway, a man whose presence was as vast and imposing as the swathes of land he claimed to own. He was dressed in a fine black coat, an absurd choice for the climate, but one that declared his separation from the common dirt-stained folk of the town. His face was framed by thick, silver-streaked mutton chops, and his eyes held the cold glint of polished stone. Behind him stood 2 of his ranch hands, men who looked as if they had been carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mesas. "Sheriff." Thorne boomed his voice, accustomed to being obeyed. "I heard there was trouble. My men reported a squaw man riding into town with a white woman in tow." He fixed his gaze on Atsa, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Now I'm handling it, Thorne." Brody said, his tone weary. He had the unenviable job of keeping the peace between Thorne's ever-expanding empire and the Navajo whose lands were being squeezed dry. Thorne ignored him, his eyes landing on Ilara. His expression softened into one of theatrical concern. "My dear woman, are you all right? What did this savage do to you?" Atsa remained silent, his face a mask of stone. He had learned long ago that words were useless against men like Thorne. They heard only what they wanted to hear. Ilara flinched under Thorne's gaze. She clutched the silver locket at her throat, a reflexive, protective gesture. He saved me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes pleading. "It was your men, Mr. Thorne. The ones with the double-cross brand on their saddles. They're the ones who left me for dead." The air in the small office crackled with tension. Thorne's face darkened, the feigned sympathy vanishing like a mirage. "That is an outrageous accusation. My men are loyal cattlemen, not kidnappers." He turned on Atsa. This is his doing. He's filled her head with lies to stir up trouble. He's been a thorn in my side for years, him and his people raiding my herds, encroaching on my land. That's enough, Thorn. The sheriff cut in, stepping between the two men. He looked at Atsa. You brought her here. That's the end of your involvement. But for Atsa, it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The locket around Alara's neck was a chain, binding him to a past he had a duty to set right. Every time he looked at it, he saw the face of the woman from the fire, her eyes wide with terror, as the flames consumed her home. He had been a part of the violence that night, a part of the chaos that had shattered a family. Now, 15 years later, that violence had resurfaced, wrapped around the neck of this terrified woman. He felt the weight of an old debt, a debt that could only be paid in justice. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the sheriff and turned to leave. As he stepped back out into the blinding sun, he heard Thorn's voice, low and menacing, follow him. You watch your step, Goldtooth. This town doesn't have room for your kind of trouble. Atsa walked on the threat settling in the air behind him. He was haunted not by the ghosts of the dead, but by the echoes of their lives. The locket was one of those echoes, and he knew he would not rest until he understood why it had come back. The next morning, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name but could not ignore, Atsa returned to the sheriff's office. Alara was there, looking slightly more composed, having been given a room at the boarding house. She sat stiffly, recounting her story for a second time, this time with more detail. She claimed Thorn's men had tried to force her to sign over the deed to her small, hardscrabble homestead, a patch of land that bordered Thorn's massive ranch, and more importantly, had access to a spring-fed creek. When she refused, they had taken her. They said Mr. Thorn wants all the water in this valley. She said, her voice trembling with manufactured conviction. They said he'd get it one way or another. The story was neat, plausible. Thorn was a greedy man, and his ambition was no secret. Yet, as Atsa listened, a sliver of doubt wedged itself in his mind. The pieces fit together too perfectly, like a puzzle assembled by a careful hand. Sheriff Brody, however, was caught between a rock and a hard place. An accusation is one thing, ma'am, he said, rubbing his tired eyes. Proof is another. Thorn owns half this territory. I can't just go arresting his men on your word alone. It was then that Atsa spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of his decision. I will look. Brody sighed. Atsa, I told you to stay out of it. Thorn is already sharpening his knives for you. The woman's land is near the border of my people's territory. Atsa stated, offering a reason that was true, but not the whole truth. Thorn's aggression affects us all. I will look for proof. His connection to the locket compelled him. It was a silent promise to the ghosts of 15 years ago. He had failed to bring peace then. Perhaps he could bring justice now. Leaving the office, he headed not for Alara's homestead, but back to the desolate silence of the Silver Creek mine. A trap clumsily set often leaves traces of the trapper. The sun beat down as he retraced his steps, and the landscape's harshness a familiar comfort. Near the mine's entrance, half hidden under a pile of loose rock, he found it a length of rope frayed at one end. Coiled within, it was a brand, the distinct double cross of Thorn's ranch, seared into the fibers. It was exactly what Alara had described. Too exactly. It felt planted, a piece of evidence left not to be found by a lawman, but to be stumbled upon by a man already convinced of the suspect's guilt. He pocketed the rope, but the seed of suspicion in his mind began to sprout. That evening, he went to the saloon. It was the heart of Redemption Gulch, a place that pulsed with cheap whiskey-strained laughter and simmering resentment. Thorn's men were there, clustered at a corner table, their arrogance taking up more space than their bodies. Atsa ordered a water at the bar, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He approached their table, holding up the branded rope. "This looked familiar," he asked, his voice calm. One of them, a thick-necked man named Jed, sneered. "Lots of rope in the territory, Injun. Now get lost before you get hurt." "This rope was found near the mine, where a woman was left to die," Atsa said, letting his words hang in the tense silence. Jed stood up, knocking his chair over. "You accusing us?" Atsa didn't flinch. "I am asking a question." The confrontation was short-lived. Jed drew back a fist, but before he could swing, the saloon doors opened, and Thorne himself strode in. His cold gaze swept the room, landing on Atsa with the force of a physical blow. "My men have no time for your games, Goldtooth," Thorne said, his voice dripping with authority. He nodded to his men. "We're leaving." As they filed out, Jed deliberately slammed his shoulder into Atsa's, a petty act of aggression that was also a clear warning. Atsa had made himself a target. He had confronted the lion in his den, and now the whole pride knew his scent. As he stood alone at the bar, he felt the eyes of the entire town on him, marking him as a man who had chosen a side, a man who was now standing in the way of power. The path he had chosen because of a silver locket was growing darker and more dangerous with every step. Over the next few days, the town's hostility toward Atsa solidified from suspicion into a hard, sharp-edged certainty. Thorne's influence was a poison that seeped into every corner of Redemption Gulch. The blacksmith who once gave Atsa a respectful nod now refused to meet his eye. The mercantile owner charged him double for a bag of flour. He was an outcast, a pariah, the living embodiment of the conflict the settlers so desperately wanted to either win or forget. He continued his investigation, driven by the inconsistencies that nagged at him like a persistent fly. He rode out to Alara's homestead. It was a pitiful place, a small, dusty cabin with a few acres of withered corn. But the spring-fed creek she had mentioned was real, a ribbon of life in the parched land, and he could see why Thorne would covet it. Yet the signs of a struggle she had described, an overturned wagon, scattered belongings, were not there. The ground was undisturbed, save for the tracks of a single rider. He found Alara in town, speaking with the doctor. He approached her, keeping his voice low. "Your wagon, where is it?" She started, a flicker of panic in her eyes, before it was quickly masked by sorrow. They pushed it into the canyon. Everything I owned." She clutched the locket, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as a telephysical anchor in a sea of lies. When he pressed for the location of the canyon, her directions were vague, her memory suddenly cloudy. She would look away, her fingers twisting the silver chain, her answers evasive. The story was fraying at the edges. It was during one of these unsettling conversations that he first saw the man. He was leaning against the assayer's office, whittling a piece of wood, seemingly just another prospector passing through. But his eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on Atsa and Alara. He was older, with a lean, wiry frame, and a face weathered by sun and something deeper, a sorrow that had settled into the lines around his mouth. He offered Atsa a friendly nod as he passed, a gesture of camaraderie in a town that offered none. "No, tough crowd," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He introduced himself as Silas Kane. "Heard you're the one who found that poor woman. Sticking your neck out for her, too. Takes a certain kind of man to stand up to a bully like Thorne." Atsa was wary. Kindness was a rare currency in these parts, and often counterfeit. "Thorne is a problem for everyone," he replied noncommittally. Kane smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "That he is. I've been prospecting these hills for months. I see things, hear things. He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. I saw a couple of Thorne's men riding hard from the direction of the North Trail the day that woman went missing. They were trying not to be seen. He was feeding Atsa exactly what he wanted to hear, confirming the narrative Alara had spun. But instead of reassuring Atsa, it set his teeth on edge. Kane's information was too helpful, his demeanor too friendly. He was like a man offering water in the desert. You had to wonder if it was poisoned. For the next few days, Kane seemed to be everywhere. He'd appear at the saloon to share a quiet word, offering another piece of evidence, a rumor he'd overheard a location where Thorne's men gathered in secret. He spoke of justice, of the need for good men to act when the law was afraid. He probed Atsa's past with subtle questions, disguised as idle chatter. "A man like you," he said one evening as they watched the sun bleed across the horizon, "you must have seen your share of injustice. On both sides." Atsa felt the man's words prying at the locked box in his mind, the one that held the memory of the fire. "The desert doesn't forget," Atsa said, his voice flat. "Neither do men." Kane's eyes glinted with a strange light. "No," he said softly, "they don't." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place late one night. Atsa was resting his horse at the livery when he heard hushed voices from the alley behind. He moved with the silence of a shadow, pressing himself into the darkness. It was Alara, her voice no longer panicked or pleading, but sharp and urgent. And she was speaking to Silas Kane. "He's getting suspicious," she said, her tone laced with anxiety. "He keeps asking questions I can't answer. Just hold on a little longer." Kane's voice replied, no longer gentle but cold and hard as iron. "He's walking into the trap. He can't help himself. A man with a guilty conscience is easy to lead." Atsa felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't understand, manipulated by a friendly prospector and a damsel in distress who was anything but. He stepped out of the shadows, the moonlight catching the grim set of his jaw. Alara gasped, stumbling back. Kane, however, did not look surprised. He simply straightened up, the folksy prospector persona dissolving like smoke, leaving behind something chillingly familiar. His eyes fixed on Atsa were filled with a cold, burning hatred that was 15 years old. "The locket." Atsa said the words, cutting through the tense silence of the alley. It was a lure. Kane offered a slow, cold smile. It did not reach his eyes. Those eyes were embers glowing with a patient, long-stoked fire. Everything was a lure, Gold Tooth. The kidnapping, the planted evidence, the whispers against Thorne. All of it designed for you. A trap built from your own guilt. Alara shrank back, her face pale in the moonlight. "Silas, please." "Be quiet, niece," Kane commanded without looking at her. His entire focus was on Atsa, a predator who finally had his prey cornered. He reached into his own shirt and pulled out a cord. Dangling from it was another silver locket, this one gleaming as if it had been polished every day for a decade and a half. It too bore the image of a juniper tree. "This belonged to my wife, Sarah. The one you found on Alara was a copy I had made. The original belonged to her mother, my sister. A family heirloom." The name Sarah landed like a stone in Atsa's memory. He saw her face again, framed by fire, her hand clutching this very locket. "My name is not Kane." The man continued, his voice low and raw with ancient pain. "It is Silas Roberts. My son Thomas was 7 years old. They died in the fire your people set. I was away trading for supplies. When I returned, all I found was ash and bone. And you." Atsa remembered. He had seen a man stumbling through the smoldering ruins, his cries of anguish a sound so inhuman it had haunted his sleep for years. "I saw you," Silas hissed, taking a step forward. "A young brave standing on the ridge, watching the embers die. I swore that day I would find you. I spent years learning your ways, your language, tracking the stories of a young warrior who left his people a man they called Goldtooth because of a strange yellow fleck in his eye. A man who couldn't live with what he'd done." His plan unfolded with devastating clarity. He had orchestrated everything. He had used his niece Alara to play the victim, knowing the story of a land grab by Thorn would be instantly believed. He had manipulated Atsa, using the locket as a key to unlock his past, compelling him to seek a justice that was never the true objective. The goal wasn't to clear Alara's name or to stop Thorn. It was to ruin Atsa. "I don't want to just kill you," Silas said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "That would be a mercy. I wanted you to feel what I felt. To be an outcast, to be hunted, to have everything you care about destroyed by lies." He gestured vaguely toward the town. "And the final piece is already in place." As if on cue, a shout echoed from the main street. "Murder! The sheriff's been shot!" Panic erupted. Doors flew open. Men spilled into the street carrying lanterns that cast frantic, dancing shadows. Atsa knew with a sickening certainty what he would find. Silas had not just set a trap, he had sprung it. This was the frame. He broke from the alley, pushing through the growing crowd toward the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Brody lay on the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He was gone. And lying on the desk, placed for all to see, was Atsa's own hunting knife, the one with the distinctive eagle feather tied to the pommel. The one he had used to cut Alara free. Bartholomew Thorn was the first to point his face, a mask of outrage and triumph. "There he is, the killer. He did it. I told you he was trouble." The crowd turned as one, their fear and suspicion instantly coalescing into a single, murderous entity. They saw the Navajo warrior, the dead sheriff, the bloody knife. The conclusion was simple, immediate, and absolute. "To get him," someone roared. Atsa was no longer an investigator or a man seeking redemption. He was a fugitive. He backed away, his mind racing. There was no explaining this, no reasoning with a mob that tasted blood. Silas Kane had played his hand perfectly. He had turned the entire town into his weapon. Atsa's instincts took over. He vaulted over the railing of the boardwalk, landing silently in the dust of the side street. A gunshot splintered the wood where he had been standing. The hunt had begun. He fled into the darkness, the sounds of the posse forming behind him, a chorus of angry shouts and the thunder of hooves. He was running not just from them, but from the ghost of Silas Kane, a man consumed by a 15-year-old fire. The Badlands, once a place of quiet contemplation, became a hunting ground. Atsa moved through the familiar canyons and arroyos, but now they offered not solace, but a temporary reprieve. He was the fox, and the hounds were baying at his heels. The posse, led by a furious Bartholomew Thorn, who had seized the mantle of authority, was relentless. They were clumsy, loud, and predictable, but they were numerous, and their righteous anger burned hot. For 2 days, Atsa used his knowledge of the land to stay one step ahead. He left false trails that led them into box canyons, doubled back on his own tracks, and used the wind to carry his scent away. He was a ghost in the rocks, a whisper in the sagebrush. But it was an exhausting, solitary existence. He was not only fighting the posse, but also the poison of Silas Kane's revelation. Kane's vendetta was a masterpiece of misdirected rage. He blamed Atsa for the fire, for the loss of his world. Atsa could not deny his presence at the raid. He had been there. He had been part of the force that brought violence to Cain's doorstep. The question of who had actually started the blaze felt like a secondary point to the larger sin. His guilt was a heavy stone in his gut. He had to clear his name, but more than that, he had to stop Cain. A man so consumed by vengeance would not be satisfied with framing him for one murder. His hatred was an inferno, and it would burn down the whole town if it meant Atsa was caught in the blaze. What was his endgame? Hiding in a shallow cave overlooking the trail, Atsa watched the posse ride by their faces, grim in the afternoon sun. He needed proof. He needed to find the flaw in Cain's plan. The answer, he realized, lay not in the desert, but back in Redemption Gulch. Cain was still there, playing the part of the concerned citizen, watching his intricate design unfold. That night, under the cover of a sliver of moon, Atsa slipped back towards the town. He moved like a wraith, avoiding the main roads, his senses on fire. He tethered his horse in a gully and approached on foot the town, a small cluster of flickering lights against the immense dark canvas of the plains. He made his way to the back of the doctor's office. He knew Dr. Adams, a decent man who had treated his people with fairness in the past. He needed medicine for a gash on his arm from a fall, and more importantly, he needed information. He found the doctor in his study poring over a medical journal by lamplight. "Atsa, they'll hang you if they find you here." Dr. Adams whispered, his eyes wide with alarm, as Atsa slipped through the unlocked window. "I did not kill the sheriff." Atsa said, his voice low and urgent. "I was framed by a man named Silas Cain." He quickly explained the deception, the locket, the 15-year-old grudge. The doctor listened, his expression shifting from fear to a dawning horror. Silas, the prospector. He was here just yesterday talking about how the town needed to be strong to root out the savage element once and for all. He's been whipping up Thorne's men into a frenzy. Suddenly, the door to the office creaked open. The doctor's young son, Daniel, a boy of about 8, stood in the doorway rubbing his eyes. "Papa, I heard voices." Dr. Adams quickly ushered the boy back to bed, but the interruption had been a stark reminder of the stakes. Innocent people were now entangled in Cain's web. "What is his plan?" Atsa pressed. "What does he want?" "I don't know," the doctor confessed. "But he's been asking strange questions about the town's water supply, about the big tower at the edge of town. He claimed he was worried about it being contaminated." The water tower. It was the lifeblood of the town, a massive wooden structure that stood sentinel over the dusty streets. It was the most vulnerable point in Redemption Gulch. As if summoned by their words, a strange sound began to build outside. It started as a low moan, a whisper that rattled the window pane. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the fine, stinging grit of the desert. The sky to the west was no longer black, but a churning, bruised purple. A sandstorm was coming. Atsa knew instantly. This was Cain's endgame. The storm would provide chaos, cover, confusion. It was the perfect stage for a final act of destruction. He had to get to that water tower. As he turned to leave, a scream tore through the rising howl of the wind. It came from the front of the house. It was Daniel. Atsa and the doctor rushed into the main room to see the front door wide open, swinging wildly in the wind. Standing on the porch, silhouetted against the dust-choked street, was Silas Cain. And in his arms, he held the struggling form of the doctor's son. Cain's face was a mask of triumphant madness. "The final piece, Gold Tooth," he yelled over the wind. "A man with a guilty conscience is easy to lead. especially when you give him another child to fail to save. He disappeared into the swirling vortex of sand, his laughter swallowed by the storm. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sand and fury. The sun was gone, blotted out by a roaring, suffocating curtain of brown. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at roofs and rattling windows, turning Redemption Gulch into a blind, chaotic hell. Atsa tied a cloth over his face, the stinging grit already abrading his skin. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Shapes moved like phantoms in the gloom, panicked townsfolk scrambling for shelter, horses rearing in terror. It was the perfect cover. He sprinted through the disorienting chaos, his destination burned into his mind, the water tower. It stood at the town's highest point, and he could just make out its skeletal frame against the churning sky. He navigated by instinct, the layout of the town mapped in his memory. The storm was a physical enemy pushing against him, trying to scour him from the earth. As he neared the base of the tower, he saw him. Silas Kane was halfway up the ladder, the small, struggling form of Daniel slung over his shoulder. At the base of the tower's massive wooden legs, Atsa saw the telltale bundles of dynamite, their fuses snaking together, leading to a small, ticking clockwork timer sheltered from the wind in a leather pouch. The stakes were absolute: the life of a child, the life of the town, and a final, terrible reckoning. Atsa began to climb. The wind tore at him, trying to rip his hands from the wooden rungs. Splinters dug into his palms. He focused on the rhythm of his ascent, his breath hot and ragged behind his mask. Below the town was a cacophony of muffled shouts and the roar of the gale. Up here there was only the wind and the man above him. He was halfway up when Kane looked down, his eyes wild and wide in the stormlight. "You came, I knew you would. You can't help but play the hero, can you, trying to wash away the stain of what you are?" Kane reached the top platform, securing the terrified boy to a post. He turned, a revolver appearing in his hand. He fired the shot, a flat crack against the wind's howl. The bullet splintered the wood next to Atsa's head. 15 years I've waited for this moment. Kane screamed, his voice strained to be heard over the storm. To see the look in your eyes as you fail again. Atsa kept climbing, his movement steady, betraying none of the turmoil in his soul. He reached the platform, pulling himself over the edge. He and Kane stood facing each other on the swaying structure, 20 yards apart, with a terrified child and a ticking bomb between them. The timer on the dynamite read 5 minutes. "It ends here, Silas." Atsa said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the din. "It ended for me 15 years ago." Kane retorted, his face contorted by grief and madness. "In a fire you started." "Did I?" Atsa challenged, taking a slow step forward. "Or is that just the story you told yourself until you believed it?" Kane laughed, a broken, chilling sound. "It doesn't matter anymore. Justice is what we make it. Tonight I make mine. This town will die of thirst and fire just as my family did. And you will watch." As he spoke, he fumbled inside his coat, pulling out a small leather-bound journal. He threw it onto the platform between them. "I found this last week, on the body of a drunkard who used to ride for Thorne. A confession. He and another man went to my homestead after your raid looking for plunder. They were careless. They knocked over a lantern in the barn." The secondary twist, the devastating truth, hit Atsa with the force of a physical blow. The fire, the central pillar of Kane's entire existence of hatred, wasn't set by the Navajo. It was an accident caused by the greed of Thorne's own men. It wasn't you. Kane spat, tears streaming down his face, instantly dried by the scouring wind. "It was never you. But it doesn't matter, you were there. You brought the violence to my door. Your raid was the spark, even if you didn't light the flame. It's too late for truth now. There is only revenge. He raised the pistol to fire, but in that moment of crazed revelation, his guard had dropped. Atsa lunged. He tackled Cain, sending them both crashing to the wooden planks. The gun flew from Cain's hand, skittering across the platform. They grappled two men locked in a struggle fueled by a generation of pain. Cain was wiry and surprisingly strong, his rage giving him a manic energy. They rolled dangerously close to the edge. Below the world was a swirling vortex of dust. Atsa saw the timer. 2 minutes. He broke free, scrambling for the dynamite. Cain was on him again, a knife in his hand. The blade slashed Atsa's arm. Atsa grunted, delivering a sharp blow to Cain's jaw, stunning him for a precious second. He ignored the pain, his focus absolute. The fuses. He had to cut the fuses. He used his own knife, sawing at the thick cords. 1 minute. He sliced through the main fuse leading to the timer, just as Cain tackled him again. They struggled a desperate final battle. Cain, in his blind fury, pushed them both towards the edge of the platform. Suddenly, a tripwire Cain had set for Atsa caught his own foot. He stumbled backward with a cry of shock, his arms flailing. He went over the edge. For a heart-stopping second, he clung to the platform, his fingers scrabbling for a hold. His hate-filled eyes met Atsa's. For the first time, Atsa saw not a monster, but a man drowning in a grief so profound it had erased him. Atsa reached for him. His hand was inches from Cain's when the man's grip failed. Silas Cain fell, a silent, dark shape swallowed instantly by the roaring sandstorm. Atsa pulled himself back, his chest heaving. He cut Daniel free, shielding the boy's body with his own, as the storm raged. The ticking had stopped. The immediate danger was over. The climax of a 15-year vendetta had ended not with a bang, but with the tragic fall of a man consumed by a misplaced rage. As if the violence of the climax had broken its spine, the sandstorm began to recede. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful moan, and the thick brown curtain of dust thinned, allowing a weak, watery sunlight to filter through. The world was remade, coated in a fine layer of red dust, silent and still. Atsa carried the boy Daniel down the ladder of the water tower. A crowd had gathered at its base, their faces pale and streaked with dirt, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. They had seen the struggle on the platform, phantoms battling in the heart of the storm. They had seen Cain fall. Dr. Adams rushed forward, enveloping his son in a desperate embrace. He looked at Atsa, his eyes filled with a gratitude that needed no words. Bartholomew Thorne pushed through the crowd, his face a thundercloud of confusion and fury. "What is the meaning of this, Gold Tooth? What have you done?" He demanded, his authority already sounding hollow. Atsa did not answer him directly. He walked over to where the wind had pinned Cain's leather-bound journal against the leg of the tower. He picked it up and handed it to the town's new unofficial lawman, a broad-shouldered blacksmith who held a shotgun and the respect of the common folk. "Read it," Atsa said, his voice raw. In the stunned silence, the blacksmith opened the journal and began to read aloud. The words of a dead man, scrawled in a drunken hand, told the story of a 15-year-old crime. He confessed to looting the Roberts homestead after a Navajo raid and accidentally starting the fire that killed a woman and a child, a fire for which everyone, including Silas Cain himself, had blamed the Navajo. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Eyes shifted from Atsa to Thorne. The drunkard had been one of Thorne's men. The greed that had led to the fire was a reflection of the greed that had poisoned the entire valley, a poison that emanated from one man. Thorne paled. Lies, the ravings of a dead drunkard. But the seed of truth had been planted. The townspeople looked at Thorne not with fear, but with dawning comprehension. They saw the dead sheriff, the framed Navajo, the attempted destruction of their town, and it all traced back to the dark secrets of this one powerful man. Alara, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward, her face a mask of shame and remorse. "It's true," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "My uncle, Silas, he told me everything. He was driven mad by his grief. He blamed Atsa, but he hated Thorn for what he represented. He wanted to destroy them both. The evidence was overwhelming. The tide of public opinion, once a weapon aimed at Atsa, turned with unstoppable force upon Bartholomew Thorn. The blacksmith leveled his shotgun. "You're not going anywhere, Thorn." The falling action was swift, and the resolution as clean as the air after the storm. Atsa, now vindicated, simply watched as the townspeople, their own agency finally reclaimed, took Thorn into custody to await the arrival of the U.S. Marshals. Justice, true and earned, had finally come to Redemption Gulch. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the town. Bartholomew Thorn was taken away in irons, his empire of greed and intimidation crumbling into dust. Alara, having given a full confession, accepted her punishment with a quiet dignity, sentenced to a year of service at the territorial mission, a penance for her role in her uncle's tragic scheme. The people of Redemption Gulch, humbled by their near destruction and their own misplaced blame, began to look at Atsa differently. The suspicion in their eyes was replaced by respect and then by gratitude. The sheriff's job was offered to him, but he quietly declined. He was not a lawman. He was a bridge. One clear, cool morning, he rode out from the town, leaving the world of men behind and entering the timeless expanse of his own lands. He rode to a high mesa that overlooked the entire valley. From here, he could see the small, hopeful cluster of buildings that was Redemption Gulch on one side and the vast sacred lands of the Dine on the other. He stood between them, a solitary figure against the endless sky. From his pouch, he took the tarnished silver locket the copy Silas Kane had made. He had retrieved it from Alara, a final piece of the past that needed to be laid to rest. It felt cold and heavy in his palm, a small object that had carried the weight of so much pain, guilt, and misdirected fury. He thought of Silas, a man so broken by loss that he had become a mirror of the violence that destroyed him. He thought of the family from long ago, their lives cut short by a cascade of greed, fear, and misunderstanding. With his knife, he dug a small hole in the hard red earth at the base of a young, resilient juniper tree, its branches reaching for the sun. He looked at the locket one last time, the engraved tree, a symbol of life and endurance. He had carried the ghost of that night for 15 years, allowing it to define him as a man caught between two worlds belonging to neither. But now he understood. His place was not in one world or the other, but here in the space between, to stand for understanding where there was hatred and to seek justice where there was greed. He placed the locket in the earth and covered it over, burying the ghost of the past. It was not an act of forgetting, but of acceptance. It was planting a seed for a new beginning, a silent promise to the land and to all its people. He would not leave. He would stay a guardian of the fragile peace, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, redemption could take root and grow. He stood, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the two worlds met, and felt, for the first time in a long time, a sense of peace.